you think you are? Have you ever had anyone say that to you? Who do you think you are? You know, that can actually be said in a positive way, or it can be said in a negative way. In a positive way, maybe you're a part of a civic group, you're doing a fundraiser for the group, maybe like the men's group here at church, and all the men are given 10 tickets to sell, but you sell 100 tickets. And so you come back to the meeting, and you announce the fact that you sold 100 tickets when everybody else only sold 10 or less. And then you hear someone say, whoa, 100 tickets, who do you think you are? That's great, good job. Good job. Then again, when you were younger, and you did something to disappoint your mother, maybe you did exactly the opposite of what she taught you to do, or you might have heard something like this from her. Exactly who do you think you are, young man, to have done that in the way in which you did? And just to be fair, if you were a female here this morning, exactly who do you think you are, young lady, acting in the way you did? Who do you think you are? Have you ever thought about that? Maybe you're laying in bed at night. Oh man, when I do this, it's like my head wants to explode. But you're just sitting there and thinking, you know, who am I? I mean, I'm just one of 7.4 billion people in this world. And I'm riding on a planet that's just like one planet in the midst of 8 planets in our solar system. And in the term of numbers of solar systems present in the universe, you know, like I think there's like 300 billion stars just like in the Milky Way. So if 10% of them have planets, that means that there are around 30 billion planets in our galaxy alone, and there are over 100 billion galaxies, they tell us, in the observable universe. I mean, whoa, the universe is big. Who do you think you are? Do you recognize yourself? I mean, okay, physically speaking, do you know who you are? Do you recognize yourself? If I gave you a blank sheet of paper this morning and a drawing pencil, could you draw yourself? Can you draw yourself? Can you draw a picture of yourself from memory? You know, back in 2000, Tom Hundley, he's an editor for the Chicago Tribune, he did a story on a fellow by the name of Andros Thomas. Andros Thomas is actually the name that officials gave a certain man decades ago in the Russian psychiatric hospital. See, what had happened is that this gentleman had been drafted into the Russian army, but the authorities had mistaken his native Hungarian language as a bunch of gibberish and thought he was a lunatic. So they had him committed. And after they had him committed, everyone forgot about him for 53 years. Now, in 1997, according to Tom Hundley of the Tribune, a psychiatrist at the hospital began to realize what had happened. And after 53 years, this doctor helped Tomas recover the memories of who he was and from where he had come. And around the turn of the century, Tomas returned home to Budapest as a war hero there. He was proclaimed to be, quote, the last prisoner of World War II, unquote. But think about it, over 5 decades, not only had this man forgotten his real name, he hadn't even seen his own face. Can you imagine? So according to this news account, and I quote, for hours the old man studies the face in the mirror, the deep-set eyes, the gray stubble on the chin, the furrows of the brow. It is his face, but it is a startling revelation, unquote. I mean, imagine looking in the mirror one day and not recognizing your own face. That would be disconcerting, would it not? Not to recognize your own face. And yet there are more people than you might imagine who are not able to perform that simple task. According to U.S. neurological research, a small percentage of the human population has a condition in which they cannot recognize faces. People with this condition often become shy and isolated, obviously. They have trouble making friends because they cannot recognize the faces of their classmates or family members or business colleagues. And even more perplexing, at times they cannot even recognize their own faces. Scary. I mean, physically speaking, that's scary. And I hope that many of you can at least recall how you look. If you drew it on a piece of paper, it might be backwards because you always see it in the mirror, but okay, you can recall it. But this morning, I want to ask you about your spiritual condition. Spiritually. Do you recognize yourself spiritually? The Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 1, and I think this is one of the first stories that we learn in Sunday school, because it's right there at the beginning of the Bible. It's a once upon a time story that sets the stage for our relationship with God. We're told there that we were made in the image of God. We were good, and we were happy, and we were free to be who we wanted to be and all that God intended for us to be. But then we read a little further. And we do have this conjunction. Don't you hate the conjunctions that appear in the Bible? But when we wander too far from God, as Adam and Eve discovered, when we follow our own reckless and self-centered desires down paths of destruction, we one day reach a place where we lose touch completely with the person we were created to be. And when that happens, what was once formed in God's image is drastically deformed by the power of sin. And when we are crippled by sin, we look in the mirror of our souls and we no longer see a child of God. We no longer remember that we were created in the image of God. No, we see failure and we see brokenness and we lose hope. And then the father of lies comes along and he tells us that on account of our sin, you're nothing. You're not worthy. No one cares about a person like you. Look at what you've done. And many tend to believe the lie. The fact of the matter is that when we cannot see the image of God in us any longer, then we no longer recognize our own face. Sin or missing the mark or living selfishly can cause the image of God within us to become tarnished or at least blurry. One man who understood this was King David. The same King David who wrote Psalm 51, which we use this morning as our prayer of confession. A powerful psalm. Of course, I think probably to better understand Psalm 51, it might have been helpful for all of us to lie down, face forward to the ground as we offered that psalm. Because that's where these words come from. From a man who was so broken by his sinful acts that all he could do was lie down, face forward to the floor, and beg for God's mercy. Have you ever been there? I mean, David, a man who was once chosen by God, anointed to lead God's people, a king whose relationship with God was so intimate that he danced with reckless abandon. He knew he was created in the image of God, yes, and he was so happy. But sin led him so far from God's original purpose for him that when he was confronted by Nathan that day with the story of his life, David did not at first recognize the story as his own. You've heard the story before. I mean, it's one of the great pieces in all of literature. The book of 1 Samuel tells us how a prophet from God chose a devout shepherd boy to be the next king of Israel. And at first, he was a great king. King David was faithful to God, and God blessed him in every way so that he prospered much. Happy are those who delight in the Lord, and all that they do, they prosper. And Nathan reminds David how God had caused him to prosper as a shepherd boy, and as a musician, and as a commander of God's army, and then as king. But then one evening, when King David should have been out on the battlefield with his men, but he was starting to take things for granted, and he figured other people should do his business for him, he chose to stay home and relax. And that night he caught a glimpse of a beautiful woman taking a bath on her rooftop. Her name was Bathsheba. And David's lust for her drove him to commit adultery and then murder and then to cover up his sins. And after arranging for the death of Bathsheba's husband, David marries her, has a child with her. It's just another political scandal. One of the great cover-ups of human history. And David thinks that he has truly escaped the consequences of his sins. But one day the prophet Nathan approaches King David and tells him a parable about a rich man who steals a little lamb, the only lamb that poor man had. And David, who was once a poor shepherd boy himself, he could relate. He's impacted emotionally by the story, and he declares, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die." David doesn't recognize himself. David does not recognize himself. A prophet of God is standing right in front of his face, retelling David's own life story to him by parable. He doesn't hear it. And the prophet holds up a rhetorical mirror, and David does not recognize his own face. "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die," roars King David. David has pronounced his own death sentence. He does deserve to die. Doesn't he? According to the letter of the law, he does deserve to die, just as all of us who give in to sin deserve to die according to the letter of the law. But thankfully, God does not rule according to the letter of the law. God rules by grace. God does not demand King David's life. He's spared. But like so many of us who one day recognize that, yes, we are indeed sinners, David no longer feels God's favor as he once did. We're torn apart by that sin. We're reminded of it constantly. It seems to haunt us on a daily basis. And David and his family suffered one tragedy after another, starting with a little boy who was born to David and Bathsheba. And that's when David falls prostrate on the floor. I mean, 7 days he fasts and he prays for the life of the child. And when after those 7 days the child dies, that precious boy dies, David stands up, he cleans himself up, he returns to his royal courts, and he dictates the words that we read in Psalm 51. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away my iniquity, cleanse me from my sin." Now, we prayed that prayer this morning. I don't know if you took it seriously. I don't know if you thought that prayer had anything to do with you or not. I'm pretty sure that for me and for everyone here at some point in our lives, maybe multiple times, that prayer is something that we wanted to pray. "For I know my transgression and my sin, it's always there. It haunts me every day. Against you, you only have I sinned, O God, and done what is evil in your sight." Now, I included 17 verses of that psalm this morning. That bothered Phil Maine. He thought it took up too much space in the bulletin. That's good. But I put it in the bulletin so you can take it home, so that you might look at it and reflect and meditate on it. Maybe today, maybe at a later time, maybe at a time when a situation like King David faced, maybe not as serious, but similar, you might pull it out. Because I think we could spend a year meditating on Psalm 51. I'm not going to do it. But we could, because there's so many beautiful and meaningful phrases in it. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love." Is that where we begin with God when we mess up? I don't know. I think we could learn from David. Because David doesn't begin, "Have mercy on me, O God, I didn't mean to do it." He doesn't say, "Have mercy on me, O God, because everybody else is doing it too." "Have mercy on me, O God, I'm not such a bad person." Did you see this guy over here? But listen to David's words. Maybe they should be our words when we do that which is not pleasing in God's sight. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love." That's what the choir sung this morning. Were you listening? "According to your great compassion, blot out my transgression." Here's a vital thing we must know about prayer and grace and mercy and forgiveness. It is founded on God's unfailing love. Remember, we serve a God who is not just holy, but holy, holy, holy. And when the biblical writers wanted to add emphasis, they used repetition. God is not simply holy. God is holy, holy, holy. The perfect divinity. Sin is a big deal when we're dealing with a holy, holy, holy God. David, actually, in this Psalm 51, uses 3 different words for sin. They're Hebrew words. They're not as easily perceived in the English. They refer to failing to live up to God's standard of holiness, choosing to rebel against those standards, deviating from those standards. I think what David is trying to say is that there's probably a billion different ways that each and every one of us can fall short of the holy nature of God. So when David begs in verse 2, cleanse me from my sin, he literally is saying, unsin me. It's kind of like on Facebook where you want somebody to unfriend you. Unsin me. Let me start all over again. I know this isn't what a child of God looks like. I don't know, maybe it's too late for me. But King David knew something that you and I need to know, my friends. In spite of this horrible deviation in his life from God's plan for his life, he still remembers God's mercy. You see, it does not matter what we've become. What matters is who God is. What would we have to believe about God to trust that God would actually answer David's prayer and that God would answer our prayer if we prayed something like David prayed? Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. That's it, God's love, God's grace, God's unmerited love for sinners. Now on Mondays, some people are joining me for a study of the parables, and we did the parable of the prodigal son. The prodigal son was kind of like David. It went off and did his own selfish things, and then he comes back and he says, "What, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." When did the son say these words? After his dad hikes up his robe, runs down the driveway to put his arms around his son and hug him and give him a kiss. I mean, a dignified man running down the driveway and hugging and kissing his son. Does this sound like a father who's holding a grudge? No. It is not the father who is withholding forgiveness, you see. It is the son who needs to repent before he can accept the gift that the father has given to him undeservedly. The son tries to choke out a confession in the story of the prodigal son. He never gets it out. The father interrupts him with the news, "Hey, we're going to throw a party for you." For whom? For him, of course. For the sinful son who rejected and shamed the family. For the son who failed. For the son who rebelled. For the son who deviated from God's plan. They are throwing a party to welcome back into the family. And you think that your life is in ashes, when shaming is your constant shadow following you all over the place, when you no longer recognize yourself as a child of God, when you know that the image of God in you has become tarnished or blurred, remember that Jesus came to unsin you. It does not matter what we've become. What matters is who God is. You can start over. That's the gospel. That is the meaning of grace. David prayed, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions." That's the meaning of the cross, which once held our dear Lord, but now is empty. You see, the price of sin, your sin, my sin, his sin, her sin, has been paid. Jesus died so that he might renew the image of God in us. So we once again might recognize who we are. A priest, he had a dream. He dreamed that he was called before the judgment seat of God, and as he walked into the courtroom, what he expected to see was a huge lectern like this with a big book and a big God presiding over everything. Instead, what he discovered was this gigantic pair of scales. And on one side, there were angels piling up the good that the man had done during his life. And on the other side, there were demons. They were piling up all the bad that he had done. Now, come on, he was a priest. He had done a lot of good things. But to his horror, he noticed that the angels simply could not keep up with the demons. They didn't have enough material. And the scales began quickly to tip to the bad side. At which point the priest in his dream cries out, "Oh Christ, have mercy!" And at that moment he heard the sound of 3 blood-stained nails falling on the good side of the scales. Now the nails, they didn't look all that heavy. I mean, relative to all the other stuff that had been piled up on both sides. After all, how much could 3 nails weigh? But as they dropped onto the scales began to tip back to the good side. And no matter how fast the demons worked, no matter how much they shoveled onto this side, the scales remained always tipped to the good. Those nails, of course, were the nails driven through the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. Are there times when we look in the mirror, you do not recognize yourself as God's child? You do not any longer see the image of God in you. It's not too late to have it restored. His grace is sufficient to restore his marred image within our souls. I mean, think about that for a moment. This is our desire for this day and every day. To look into God's mirror and to see ourselves as God intended for us to be. To see in us God's image placed there by Jesus Christ. To know that we are loved by a God who showers unfailing, unending love upon us. And that we're not orphaned. We are truly a part of the family of God. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. That's our hope. And when that hope reminds us that we truly have the image of God in us, then what should we do according to Psalm 51? We should go out and live in the joy of our salvation. And we should communicate that joy to each and every person we meet, to the actions we perform, the words we speak, and even what we think about that situation or that person. It's never too late, by God's grace, to have God's image restored within us.